channel is sponsored by Great Bay Outfitters. Great Bay Outfitters is a waterfront kayak shop located near Great Bay. They are New Jersey's #1 volume dealer of Old Town kayaks. Great Bay Outfitters specializes in fishing kayaks and offers demos, rentals, repair, rigging, and a full assortment of PFDs, dry suits, motors, paddles, and accessories from many major brands. What is up, everyone? So today's video is going to be a little bit different. My friend Brian and I went out wreck fishing this morning, and we hit a bunch of different spots, and we've always been talking about dropping a camera down on some of the spots we fished just to kind of look at the structures and, you know, what's down there species wise. So what you're going to see today is all underwater. This was my first drop, and it was more of a test drop just to check to see if the clarity of the footage was going to be good. I've talked about this in the other videos. Depending on how far you rig your line from the camera really dictates how good of footage you actually capture. So we stopped short of the wreck that we were going to film first, kind of like a sand area that I'm not worried about snagging up on. And it was actually kind of interesting how many fish were off of this wreck. Now granted, a lot of these look like smaller sea bass and sea robins. So for our first stop, we went out as far as we wanted to fish for the day. So this is the deep water wreck that we're fishing off the coast of New Jersey. It is an old shipwreck. What's interesting though, once we get the bait all the way to the bottom, was I think we dropped right on a beam of the boat. And do you see all this white coral that's built up? So coral bleaching pretty much happens from a variety of reasons, but from what I understand, warmer ocean temperatures are what drive most of this to happen. When it gets to this point, a lot of this coral expel like an algae that lives in their tissues, and it gives that white color. From what I understand, whenever this does happen, there usually is a negative effect to the local fisheries. From what I understand, it's kind of like a domino effect of the healthy coral provides nutrients for smaller organisms, which larger organisms feed off of. But let's get back to looking at the wreck. Now, being that I'm just trying to get underwater footage, you're going to see a lot of fish eating at the bait and me just letting it go. I do unfortunately hook a few fish on accident, or they hook themselves, I guess you would say, because at no point was I ever setting the hook. But why I try to avoid setting the hook on these is you get this like shaky footage. And right now I have a sea robin and a sea bass that I'm reeling in. I haven't found a great method to get the bait down there without using hooks where it actually stays. But it's a work in progress. So dropping it back down after reeling those fish in, one of the first things that stuck out to me species-wise was predominantly sea bass, but there has been a variety of other ones around. And once we get this steady on the bottom, you're going to see a few fish that really don't stick out as much as the sea bass, but there are some tog down there as well. What's pretty interesting is the tog actually blend in really well with the wreck. I mean, you could see a few of them right there on the bottom that just by the stripes. And I'm actually going to freeze it in a second. There's a bigger one that's going to show up to the right. He's just kind of looking at the rig. But the sea bass were just overly aggressive compared to the tog. You can see there's one right on the bottom right corner. When I was watching the film initially, there's a lot of males. And this one that's in the frame, top of the frame, you could tell with the hump on the head and the lighter colors. But there was still a decent amount of females around. They're typically the smaller ones, kind of darker looking in comparison to the males. Now this drop was probably the closest call to snagging up that we got. But what stuck out to me about this footage here was how high up this wreck sits from the bottom, and how prone to snags you could be depending on which way you're drifting on it. From the camera to the weight is about 3 feet of distance, and even with the weight on the bottom, we're not clearing the wreck completely, which is kind of crazy. So if you're dragging something at a fast pace, like you get a drift that's just a little too quick, I could see how it's easy to snag up on spots like this. And you're going to notice I'm going to lift the rig a few times because I could feel the weight kind of feels like it's getting wedged. So I would lift it up a little bit to try and like walk it, like walk the dog, walk it over top of the structure. But I could see watching them feed how a fish can just grab the line and just bring you right into it. You're going to hear like the line shaking in a few seconds because I'm trying to free it. One of the fish, I think, pulls the rig right into this wreck. There actually were some nice sea bass around that day. In fact, we had our limit relatively quick on a day like this. Well, in the state of New Jersey, you can only keep one sea bass at this current moment per person. So we already had our limit, so I was just kind of messing around with this camera. But there was definitely some nicer size sea bass mixed in with a ton of smaller sea bass. And once again, not trying to hook these fish, but they just went crazy and hooked themselves. I was using squid and sand fleas, but honestly, I was using hard metal jigs earlier in the day and was catching kind of nicer fish without the live bait. But those of you that fish for sea bass know that it doesn't really matter. They are probably the least pickiest fish in New Jersey. They'll eat anything as long as it's in front of them. So at this point, we shifted a little bit to the side of the wreck again. One of the things that I noticed though on most of these drops was if you went off the wreck by, I don't know, 10 yards or so, it seemed like it was predominantly sea robins that were off of it. But if you were right on top of it, it was predominantly sea bass and tog with the occasional sea robin here and there. While it's been sitting on there, the bottom, just on the outskirt of the wreck, I believe, I could be wrong. You guys tell me what you think it is. I think it's a porgy that pops up into frame shortly. You're going to see that kind of like silver looking fish that's to the right of the float. Now, we've caught porgies on this specific wreck in years past, but that's what I think it is. I could be wrong. I don't think it's a trigger fish. I feel like you would see the distinctive like trigger and the frame of the fish was kind of different. But what was kind of interesting to see on camera was even these spots that were just off the wreck, like not right on top of it, if your bait sat there for, I don't know, 30 seconds or so, and it would draw a few fish in, which would draw in more fish, which kind of crazy to see, like, you know, as the frame goes on, how many more fish show up just from one or two fish kind of pecking at the bait. I'm curious if the vibrations and the sounds from that kind of trigger more fish to kind of come over and explore, because you know, when you initially drop on some of these drops, there's like no fish in the frame whatsoever. Then you start to see one or two, and then later on you start to see like droves and droves of sea bass just kind of relentlessly going for the squid. And I'll tell you what, sometimes taking a step back and just doing this type of fishing, like where you're just capturing as much footage as you can of the structures you're fishing, can be really beneficial in a lot of ways. Just understanding what species are down there, what, you know, baits they want. I know for a fact, like the sheep's head videos definitely help, because it would blow your mind the number of fish that are down there that most people aren't catching, and you know, just trying to figure out what makes these fish tick. I will say the wreck fishing this time of year can be a little bit more daunting with just the sheer number of fish that are around. you're going to see in this clip just how aggressive they really are. I mean, I end up hooking two of them, just literally leaving my line on the bottom, just how aggressively they're feeding, end up hooking themselves. And I'm not sure if you noticed it as this drop was going down, but you start to see fish about 20 feet from the bottom kind of chasing it down, which would solidify what I was seeing on the sonar, because we would see these plumes of fish that were suspended above the bottom all the way down to the bottom, and it's kind of crazy to see on film. Because earlier in the day when I was fishing epoxy jigs for them, I could feel them hitting it as it was dropping. Like, once you could always tell when you were getting really close to the bottom as the line was dropping, because you could literally feel them pecking at it. Now, a somewhat interesting observation that I found that day was where we were, the water wasn't the cleanest I've ever seen it, but it was the cleanest water we saw all day. What's interesting is later in this trip, we end up moving inshore to artificial reefs closer to the beach. And when I say the water clarity difference from where we were here to there was like mind-boggling. After seeing most of the footage we got from this day, I'm gonna try and get out later this summer and try and get some good like flounder footage. The wreck we're fishing really isn't, I mean, there's flounder around, but they're not the predominant species, I would say, on this specific wreck. I think the sea bass and the tog kind of rule the roost. This guy ended up accidentally hooking himself, but what's interesting was every time he would try and kind of wiggle, it would almost bring more fish in. Like you see a couple times in the frame that there's fish trying to eat like the float where he's already hooked, which is kind of funny. They might not be the smartest fish in the ocean. Now, I still have not found a way to perfect not hooking the fish. My biggest gripe with it is I'm more concerned of hooking into something that's going to run me into the wreck or run me into some type of structure that's a little bit less forgiving. If you could believe it, the rig that I've tied up beneath this camera is only 12-pound test. The main line I'm using to the camera is 50-pound braid. So in theory, if you were to get snagged, as long as it was beneath the camera, the leader should snap and not the main line. But one of the risks, at least why I kind of stopped dropping directly on top of where we were, was how high that wreck sits up. I could easily, if I drift into it, have the camera beneath the wreck and get it snagged in a point where if it's snagged, I'm pretty much screwed. But I mean, that's just the nature of what I'm doing. You're gonna lose a camera here and there, unfortunately. I've already learned that lesson once this year. So at this point in the day, we traveled closer near shore to a artificial reef, and what was kind of mind-boggling, where we were fishing to initially in the day to this spot was probably the difference of maybe, I don't know, 12 miles. And right now we're dropping to the bottom, and you can very vaguely see the bottom float, which was clear as day in all the other previous videos. I don't know what causes, the water clarity like this to be this bad, this close to shore, especially, handful of miles offshore just clears up so much more. What was crazy was I was getting hits like relentlessly as soon as we dropped to the bottom, but I wasn't able to see them right away or hook what it was. Eventually, I came to find out it was a school of croakers that we were on top of, because you'll see them show up What was interesting is you would see them on the sonar kind of flying by, and then sometimes they would stay on you, or they seemed like they were on the move, and you're going to see the school kind of pop into frame here. A couple of them just swirled around. There's one that's hitting the top hook. Freeze frame, you can see the two right there. But I accidentally hooked one right here, and that confirmed what we were on top of. But I think I'm going to do some more of these underwater videos moving forward. I'm just going to try and target different species and different bodies of water. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Thank you for watching.